I couldn't believe what I had just done. I had invited a man nearly twice my age into my home, but it wasn't just his age that shocked me. It was the way he looked at me, like he could see straight through to my soul. As he stepped closer, my heart raced. What was about to happen between us would change everything I thought I knew about myself. My life had always been predictable: a steady job, a small group of friends, and nights spent curled up with a book or binging the latest TV series. I'd never been one for taking risks, especially not in matters of the heart. After a messy breakup years ago, I had sworn off romance altogether, telling myself I was better off alone. But there was always this quiet ache, a longing for something more, something different. That's why the encounter at the cafe that evening felt so out of the ordinary. It was just another rainy day, and I'd stopped in for my usual cup of coffee and a moment of solitude. The sound of rain against the window was oddly soothing, and I let my eyes wander around the room. That's when I saw him. He was seated by the window, his gray hair catching the soft glow of the cafe lights. He had this quiet confidence about him, a sort of magnetism that made it impossible to look away. His eyes, strikingly blue and filled with a depth I couldn't quite place, met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. It was as if he could sense my curiosity, and to my surprise he smiled. I didn't approach him right away. Instead, I stayed in my seat, trying to focus on my coffee while stealing glances in his direction. My heart was racing, and I hated how nervous I felt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to walk over and say hello. His name was James, and he had a voice that could calm even the most anxious of hearts. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we were old friends catching up after years apart. He told me about his life, how he'd spent decades as an architect before retiring to pursue his passion for art and literature. He spoke with a wisdom and humor that had me laughing until my sides hurt. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation. Just a genuine interest in me and who I was. That evening, as the rain fell outside, I made a decision that would change everything. I invited him back to my place. As James stepped into my apartment, I suddenly felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. It had been years since I'd shared my personal space with someone. I couldn't ignore how different he was from anyone I'd ever met. His calm demeanor filled the room, yet there was an air of mystery about him that kept me on edge. We settled into the living room, a bottle of wine between us. The conversation flowed easily at first. He shared stories about his travels, his work as an architect, and his favorite books. But as the night wore on, something shifted. There was a subtle change in the way he looked at me, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't threatening, but it was intense, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. Yet small details began to stand out, his gaze lingering a little too long, the way his voice softened when he said my name. I found myself questioning his intentions, wondering if I had invited more into my life than I was prepared for. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't deny the thrill of it all. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me the way he did. At one point, he excused himself to use the bathroom. Left alone, I found myself replaying our interactions, trying to piece together what I was feeling. Was it just the wine? The rain tapping against the window added to the atmosphere, making the air feel heavy with anticipation. I couldn't shake the thought that this night might not end the way I expected. When James returned, the shift was undeniable. He sat closer to me this time, his arm resting casually on the back of the couch. There was a tension in the room that made my heart race. "You have a beautiful home," he said, his voice low and warm. But it was the way he said it, like the words carried a deeper meaning, that made me catch my breath. As the evening continued, I found myself torn between two impulses. One part of me wanted to keep things light and easy, to preserve the safe distance I had maintained with others for so long. But the other part of me, the part that had been yearning for something more, was tempted to let my guard down, to see where this connection might lead. Every glance, every word seemed to carry more weight. I noticed myself mirroring his movements without meaning to, leaning closer when he leaned in, holding his gaze longer than I should have. The room felt charged with unspoken possibilities, each one more enticing than the last. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as though the walls I'd built around myself were starting to crumble. And yet, the uncertainty of it all was almost too much to bear. Could I really trust this man I'd just met? Or was I on the verge of making a mistake I couldn't take back? I didn't have the answers, but as the night wore on, I knew one thing for certain. Something was happening between us, something neither of us could ignore. And whether it was right or wrong, I was powerless to stop it. The night seemed to deepen as James and I sat there, caught in the gravity of each other's presence. His eyes held mine with a steady intensity, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint, knowing smile. There was something disarming about his confidence, the way he seemed to understand exactly how to pull me closer without even moving a muscle. He reached for his glass of wine, the movement deliberate, his fingers brushing mine as he passed it to me. The brief contact sent a jolt through me, and I hated how easily he unsettled my composure. "I hope I'm not keeping you up too late," he said, his tone soft yet playful. There was a challenge in his words, one that made me want to defy the rules I'd set for myself. "You're not," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me, every word, every look building the tension between us. As the conversation drifted to more personal topics, I found myself revealing things I hadn't told anyone in years. He listened intently, his responses thoughtful, his gaze never wavering. It was as if he had stripped away the layers of pretense I usually hid behind, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. And yet it felt strangely freeing. When he leaned in closer, his arm brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're fascinating," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The compliment felt intimate, as though it wasn't just my words or actions that intrigued him, but something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. I laughed softly, trying to break the tension. "You barely know me." "Sometimes that's all it takes," he replied, his lips curving into a smile that made my breath catch. The air between us grew thick, the unspoken pull drawing us closer together. When his hand reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, I felt a shiver run down my spine. His fingers lingered, the touch light but electrifying. "You're different," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "And I think you know it." I didn't know how to respond. Words seemed futile in the face of the growing tension, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. Before I could think better of it, I leaned in, closing the gap between us. The first kiss was tentative, a brush of lips that left me breathless. But as I pulled back, his gaze held mine, a silent question lingering in his eyes. When I nodded, giving him permission, he leaned in again, this time with more certainty. The kiss deepened, igniting something inside me I hadn't felt in years. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer until I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, the lines between right and wrong blurring as I gave in to the moment. When we finally pulled apart, his hand cupped my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized I didn't want to stop. "Yes," I whispered, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "I'm sure." His lips found mine again, the kiss more urgent this time. I felt myself sinking into the moment, the world outside fading until it was just the two of us. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, peeling back layers I hadn't even realized were there. The sofa seemed to vanish beneath us as we moved closer together, the intensity of our connection building with each passing moment. His hands traced the contours of my back, his touch leaving a trail of heat in its wake. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so alive, so completely in tune with another person. For a moment I pulled back, searching his eyes. "This feels dangerous," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He smiled, his hand resting on my cheek. "Sometimes the most worthwhile things are." His words sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't help but smile in return. As he leaned in once more, I let myself go, surrendering to the forbidden thrill of the moment. The boundaries I had clung to for so long crumbled, leaving nothing but raw emotion and unspoken possibilities. The night unfolded in ways I never could have anticipated, each moment more intense than the last. And as I found myself in his arms, I knew there was no turning back. This was a path I had chosen, and no matter where it led, I couldn't deny the pull that had brought us here. The air in the room felt electric, each moment charged with an intensity that made my heart race. James's hand rested lightly on my arm as he pulled me closer, his gaze locking onto mine. Every touch, every word had been leading to this moment, and yet, as thrilling as it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something far bigger than I'd anticipated. As he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine, the sound of the rain outside seemed to grow louder, wrapping us in a cocoon of intimacy. His hand slid to the small of my back, guiding me closer until there was no space left between us. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only James, his warmth, his touch, and the unspoken connection we shared. But then, something unexpected happened. It started small, a faint noise in the hallway. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but when it came again, louder this time, my body tensed. James must have sensed the change in me because he pulled back, his brow furrowed as he studied my expression. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "I thought I heard something," I said, my eyes darting toward the closed door. The logical part of me insisted it was nothing, just the creaks and groans of an old building settling in the rain. But a tiny seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. James stood, his movements calm and deliberate as he crossed the room to the door. I watched as he pressed his ear to the wood, his expression unreadable. For a moment, everything was silent, and I started to convince myself it had all been in my head. But then there it was again, a soft shuffle like footsteps trying to stay quiet. James turned to me, his face serious now. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Before I could protest, he slipped out into the hallway, the door clicking softly shut behind him. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a neighbor? A stray animal? Or was it something, or someone more sinister? My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear what was happening on the other side of the door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the tension in the air almost unbearable. And then, just as I was about to get up and follow him, the door opened again. James stepped inside, his expression calm but guarded. "It's nothing," he said, though the way he avoided my gaze told me otherwise. Probably just the wind rattling something outside. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But there was something in his tone, a hint of hesitation, that made my stomach twist. I decided not to press him, at least not right now. The night was already heavy with emotion, and the last thing I wanted was to ruin whatever fragile connection we'd built. But as we settled back into the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that James was holding something back. He was quieter now, his touches more hesitant, as though he was wrestling with something he couldn't bring himself to say. The change was subtle, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "James," I said, my voice firmer than I'd intended. "What's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I can feel that something's wrong." He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window before finally meeting mine. "It's complicated," he said, his voice low. "There are things about me you don't know, things I didn't think mattered. But now I'm not so sure." I frowned, my mind racing with possibilities. "What are you talking about? What things?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of genuine conflict. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't expect to meet someone like you. And I certainly didn't expect to feel this way." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he continued, his words spilling out like a dam breaking. "I've been running from something for a long time," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "A mistake I made years ago. A mistake that's followed me ever since." The room seemed to close in around us, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest. "What kind of mistake?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "It's not safe for me to be here," he said, his voice cracking. "For either of us." My heart sank as the full weight of his confession hit me. Whatever he was hiding, it wasn't something trivial. It was something big, something dangerous. And I had invited it into my home, into my life, without even realizing it. Before I could process what was happening, James stood, his movements swift and purposeful. "I need to go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But I need you to know, tonight meant everything to me." And just like that, he was gone. I sat there, staring at the door he had just walked through, my mind reeling. The night had started as a chance encounter, a moment of spontaneity that had turned into something far more intense. But now, it felt like the beginning of something much darker, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. James had been a spark in my otherwise predictable life, a reminder that there was still so much I hadn't experienced. But he had also brought with him a shadow, a mystery I couldn't ignore. And as I sat there, replaying the events of the night in my mind, one thing became clear. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The days after James's departure were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't get his words out of my head, the regret in his voice, the way he'd looked at me like he wanted to stay but knew he couldn't. It was like the air in my apartment had changed, heavier now, filled with questions I didn't know how to answer. I replayed the night over and over in my mind, searching for clues in every glance, every touch, every word he'd said. What was he running from? And why had he come into my life only to leave so abruptly? The more I thought about it, the more the mystery consumed me. It wasn't just about James anymore, it was about the way he'd made me feel, the way he'd awakened something in me I hadn't felt in years. But with that awakening came consequences. I began to notice things I hadn't before, small, almost imperceptible changes in my daily routine. The barista at my regular cafe hesitated when I ordered my coffee, like she was about to say something but thought better of it. A neighbor I barely knew gave me a knowing look as I passed him in the hallway. Even my co-workers seemed more curious than usual, their questions about my weekend laced with a subtle undertone I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. But then, late one night, I noticed a car parked across the street from my building. It was dark, the windows tinted, and though I couldn't see who was inside, I could feel their gaze on me. My stomach twisted with unease, but I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. After all, who would be watching me? The unease only grew as the days turned into weeks. I started receiving anonymous phone calls. Silent at first, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end before the line went dead. Then came the messages. Short, cryptic notes slipped under my door, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. "Be careful," one read. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," said another. I tried to ignore them, telling myself they were some sick joke, but deep down I knew they weren't. Someone was trying to warn me, or scare me. And the only person who might have answers was James. But he was gone. I threw myself into my work, hoping the distraction would keep the fear at bay. It didn't. Every shadow felt like a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential danger. I started locking my doors obsessively, triple-checking the windows before I went to bed. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by a constant state of vigilance. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of it all became too much to bear. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my messages, searching for the one I'd sent to James the night he left. "Are you okay?" I had written. "Please just let me know you're safe." He hadn't responded. I debated whether to try again, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What would I even say? That I missed him? That I felt like my life was spiraling out of control? That I needed him to explain what was happening to me? Before I could talk myself out of it, I typed a single word. "Why?" This time, he replied. "Meet me," the message read, followed by an address I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, torn between relief and apprehension. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to pretend I'd never seen it. But another part, a larger part, needed answers. The address was a small cafe on the edge of town, far from the places I usually frequented. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. James was already there, seated at a table near the back, his expression unreadable. As I approached, he stood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't think I would either," I admitted, sliding into the seat across from him. But I didn't know who else to turn to. For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a weariness that made my chest ache. "I didn't want you to be part of this," he said. "I never should have let it get this far." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "What is this? And why am I suddenly afraid to be in my own home?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There are people who think I know things they're willing to hurt me, or anyone close to me, to get. I thought I'd left it all behind, but the moment I met you," he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine, "I knew they'd come after you too." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. "What do they want from you?" I whispered. "Something I can't give them," he said. "And now, because of me, you're in danger too." I felt my world shift, the ground beneath me crumbling as the reality of my situation set in. Whatever James had done, whatever he was running from, it had found me too. And there was no escaping it. As I sat across from James in that dimly lit cafe, the weight of his words pressed heavily on my chest. Everything in my life had felt so ordinary until now, and yet, in just a matter of days, I'd been thrust into a world I didn't understand. One where trust felt fragile and danger lurked in the shadows. I could barely process what he was saying, let alone decide what to do next. James's face was lined with regret, his usually steady demeanor cracked under the weight of his confession. "I never wanted this for you," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with an honesty that made my heart ache. I should have walked away that night at the cafe. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wanted to be angry with him, to demand answers to the questions swirling in my mind. But when I looked at him, all I saw was a man trying to protect me, even if he didn't quite know how. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment he was silent, as though weighing his words carefully. "Now," he said, "I make sure they leave you alone. I'll draw them away, give them what they're looking for if I have to. But you need to stay out of it. Promise me you'll stay out of it." His plea ignited a fire within me. "You think I can just walk away from this? From you? James, you've brought me into this whether you meant to or not. I can't pretend it never happened." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "You have a life, a safe, normal life. Don't throw it away for me." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was right. My life had been safe, predictable, even boring. But it had also been mine. And now, because of him, that safety was hanging by a thread. The rest of the conversation was a blur. James told me enough to make me understand the severity of the situation, but held back details that might implicate me further. When we parted ways, he held me tightly, whispering a quiet apology against my hair. "I'm sorry I brought this to your doorstep," he said. "But you've made me feel alive again. I'll never forget that." Watching him walk away was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. A part of me wanted to chase after him, to tell him I didn't care about the danger, but I knew that would only make things worse. He was right, I needed to let go. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my routine, but everything felt different. The streets I used to walk without a second thought now felt ominous. Each stranger's face a potential threat. I jumped at every unexpected noise, my nerves constantly on edge. I thought about James often, his smile, his warmth, the way he'd made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But with those memories came lessons I couldn't ignore. I realized how much of my life I'd spent hiding, from risks, from emotions, from the possibility of getting hurt. Meeting James had shattered that carefully constructed facade, forcing me to confront not just the danger of his world, but the walls I'd built around my own. I learned that safety, while comforting, could also be a prison. And sometimes it was worth stepping outside that comfort zone, even if it meant facing uncertainty. James was gone, and I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. But I knew that night had changed me. It had shown me the fragility of life, the power of connection, and the importance of taking risks, even when they terrified me. I couldn't control what had happened or what might come next, but I could control how I moved forward. And so, I chose to embrace the uncertainty, to face the world with an open heart, even if it meant getting hurt again. Because in the end, it wasn't about avoiding danger, it was about living fully, even in the face of it. If you were in her position, would you walk away or fight to stay by his side? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories filled with suspense, passion, and life-changing decisions. Stay tuned. Our next tale will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and trust.